growing up in Dehradun, in Doon Valley, with Rishikesh right next door, I was very blessed as a little child to meet some of the most important saints and sages of our times. Swami Shivananda, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, Anandamayi Ma, Sant Kripal Singh Ji, Neem Karoli Baba, all of whom have had huge influence on people across the world. And of course, as you mentioned, Deepak, my heart and passion for studying nature at that time took me to the foundations of quantum theory. I came to North America because my PhD guide in India was saying, just do the calculations, don't ask questions. And of course, I wasn't doing quantum theory just to do calculations. I wanted to figure out. And of course, the wonderful thing about it is, from the 1930s to now, those deep debates are still alive, and I know they'll still be alive 100 years from now. That's why I took a little time off. Even if I turn back to it at 80, we'll be discussing non-locality, we'll be discussing potentials, we'll be discussing irreducible probability. And those were the three big teachings I took out of my higher studies in physics. That we weren't inhabiting a world of billiard balls, of separation, of hard, immutable matter, of deterministic quantity with no quality. Quantum theory taught us non-separability, taught us non-locality. It taught us potential. And built into potential, the more powerful plurality, the fact that things can unfold in different ways. In India, we call it Bahuda, the Bahuda Sanskriti, you know. And that's why I love the images of Indian goddesses, always with many, many, many hands. Because nothing is just one thing. None of us are just one thing. So while in the quantum world, and we had some of the best minds sharing the quantum world with us, the billiard ball image is gone. In the real world of life and death, that billiard ball worldview is more dominant than ever. And that's the reason I've turned to areas like agriculture. Because not only is it 100 years out of date, it's a primitive science, but being so inappropriate to the complexity and self-organization and diversity of life, that crudeness of an obsolete worldview, a mechanistic reductionist framework of thinking that we received at the time of the rise of the empire, where it was considered that veneration of nature, wherewith men are imbued for what they call nature, has been discouraging impediment to the empire of man over the inferior creatures of God. That's Boyle as New England governor. Or Bacon, who said you have to torture and rape nature to know her. He even wrote a book called The Birth of Masculine Time, with the assumption that interconnectedness and understanding systems in the whole was effeminate. And I loved someone who said, I think it was Vincent Fox, who said the future will be womanly. And Gandhi said a daily prayer, make me more womanly. Caroline Merchant has talked about that the rise of that mechanical philosophy as the death of nature. Because if nature is dead, you're doing no harm. If you see nature as a nurturing mother, you couldn't be creating the level of devastation on this planet that's taking place. You could not readily slay a mother, dig her entrails, mutilate her body. But the mastery and domination images that have been built into the Baconian paradigm that continue to be called science, even in today's world, are wreaking havoc on this planet. And I saw it in my days with the Chipko movement, this amazing movement of women who came out in my region and said, we're going to hug the trees. you can't cut them. And at that time, scientific forestry treated forests as timber mines. The women taught the country that forests were related to water, forests were related to soil, forests were related to the air. It took 10 years of protests, but eventually our policies were changed. In fact, our entire environment movement was, contemporary environment movement was shaped by Chipko. And then 1984, India had a series of tragedies and disasters. The tragedy of Bhopal, where the largest human tragedy were killed. 3,000 people in one night, 30,000 dead since then, where a pesticide plant of Union Carbide leaked. That same summer, terrorism was at its height in Punjab, and the army was sent to enter the Golden Temple. The Sikhs felt very violated. 30,000 people had been killed in Punjab because of extremism, but when the Sikh security of Indira Gandhi assassinated her, there was a backlash and more Sikhs were killed, and it was a genocide. And by the end of 1984, I wanted to understand why had agriculture become like war, and realized agriculture had become like war because it came from war. Every herbicide, every pesticide that we use was a war chemical. Even the nitrogen fertilizers came out of the explosive factories. I did a study on the Green Revolution, Punjab, for the United Nations at that time, and found that that billiard ball that we'd given up in quantum theory was still alive in the category called high-yielding variety, as if that variety had fixed qualities and quantities. No, it was a high-response variety. It responded well to chemicals, which is why it was created as a dwarf variety. The soil in the textbooks of that time was defined as an empty container into which you put NPK, nitrogen, phosphate, potassium, as if that was all that the soil needed. And we've been told without the Green Revolution, the world wouldn't have been fed. Norman Borlaug got a Nobel Peace Prize for this. When I went to Punjab, I realized the fields weren't producing more than our fields up in the Garhwal, in the Himalaya. And I called that blindness the monoculture of the mind. You stop to see because you're working on producing a single commodity, just the rice, just the wheat. You increase its production at the cost of biodiversity, but at the very, very high costs to the planet and to people. 70% of all biodiversity loss in agriculture is because of the monocultures of industrial farming. 70% of the water use and waste and pollution creating dead zones in the ocean is because of industrial farming. 40% of the greenhouse gases that are creating climate change, and I've done this calculation in my book, Soil Not Oil, comes from industrial farming. And just as we were starting to get an assessment of what were the costs, there's a cancer train that leaves Punjab, because with the heavy use of pesticides, cancer has become an epidemic. And then 75% of Punjab's male population is now drug addicts. That's not any measure of prosperity. But the Green Revolution is now being overtaken by the second Green Revolution, based on genetic engineering. Once more, the old billiard ball model, now mutated into the genetic level, even though everything we know in science tells us that no gene is related to only one property, that gene behavior. You mentioned this morning, Deepak. Epigenetics, entirely new fields, gene ecology coming up, but genetic engineering is working on a 100-year-old model of physics, not even biology. And when it's at that level of life, the violence gets even deeper. There are, in my view, multiple levels of violence that have been unleashed by an agriculture in which, beginning with the mind and mental framework, the tools and technologies you evolve, basically we have declared war against the earth. And in declaring the war against the earth, we have declared war against people. I don't have the time to go through it today, but 1 billion people hungry today, and the 2 billion people suffering from diseases like obesity and diabetes, it's related to the food production system and the model that has been evolved. But the first violence that this kind of agriculture is perpetrating is a violence to life itself. We often joke that GMO now stands for God move over. And I started Navdanya, the movement to save seeds, promote organic farming and a non-violent agriculture, after 1987, where the big corporations were there saying we have to do genetic engineering in order to get patents on life. A patent means you have invented something. You are the creator. You are there for the owner. Seeds, life forms aren't inventions. An iPad might be, but the I stops there. And interestingly, the Green Revolution destruction of food, of the food basket and of the nutrition basket was so intense that it became a monoculture of rice and a monoculture of wheat, and that now at the world level, we are growing, instead of the 8,500 species of plants we ate, we are growing and trading in 8 commodities, 4 of which are spreading fastest: corn, soya, canola, cotton, because they are genetically modified, and therefore for every acreage there's a royalty return. In Punjab, the rice and wheat displaced the pulses, and we need it for a vegetarian diet. Pulses are dals. Now, the British, of course, didn't know that we use them as human food, so they called it chickpea, and when I started to save seeds, and I found the English name, it was all animal feed. Chickpea, horse gram, pigeon pea, cow pea, no human food in the pulses. And then it was degraded and displaced even further. So 2 years ago, when the food prices shot up, the tur dal, what they call pigeon pea, the adhar, shot up to 250 rupees a kilogram. And of course, there were pulse riots, and women were screaming and shouting. And from the United States was imported something called dal. It's very mysterious, selling for 25 rupees in the ration shops. And I think they got the dal from the iPhone and the iPad, thinking you just turn something into technology and people will accept it. Well, the women rejected it. At 25 rupees, they wouldn't buy it because they said this is not dal. And it wasn't. It was just reconstituted soya flour, shaped in the shape of a dal. It's called analog dal. I just call it fake food. The reason I started Navdanya was, for me, it was a very deep violation of the integrity of life and the diversity of life for a few companies to claim ownership and establish monopoly. And from there, replace living seed with terminator seed. They actually have that. We've stopped it so far through the UN. But seed that is genetically engineered to be sterile, that stops being seed, stops giving rise to life. But those kind of monopolies and those kinds of super profits also cause violence to society and to humans. Cotton is indigenous to India. There's also American variety species of cottons. They're Indian species of cottons. And Gandhi pulled out the spinning wheel for our freedom when our cotton was controlled for manufacture in England, as were the slaves that were brought to work on the cotton plantations in this country. In 1997-98, Monsanto started to enter India with its Bt cotton, which is a genetically modified cotton with a Bt toxin in it, taken from a soil organism, and now the plant is supposed to be its own pesticide factory. The price of seed jumped 8,000%. A renewable open source seed was now replaced by seed that has to be bought every year. It's not been tested, so it fails frequently. Often the farmers buy seed 3 times a year. They think they're buying different seed, but all Indian seed companies are now locked into licensing arrangements, and they can only sell BT cotton. The BT cotton, the first Bollgard 1, was supposed to control the bollworm. It's failed. They've introduced Bollgard 2. And I always remember Einstein, who told us that a clear sign of insanity is to do the same thing again and again, expecting a different outcome. Now, 2 toxic genes will still create a treadmill and still lead to emergence of resistance in pests, which is one more signal that nature has intelligence. When we bombard pests with pesticides, they emerge resistance. The high rates of failure, the monopoly, the royalty collections, 1,000 crores, which is 10 billion rupees, which is about $500 million, is the royalty outflow on cotton, just on cotton. 95% of the cotton is now owned and controlled by Monsanto. And what that does for the farmer, where is this money coming from? But farmers who get into debt. And indebted farmers are committing suicide, mostly in the cotton belt. 250,000, 250,000 farmers have committed suicide in the last 15 years. That's official Government of India data. And that violence for me is totally unacceptable. It's not necessary, because if you have farmer seed, open pollinated seed, farmers do organic farming, they get a fair price for what they grow, no suicide should be taking place. And that's why we've started Fibers of Freedom, a program in the suicide belt of Maharashtra to create seed banks, which is what we do. We've created 66 across the country over the last 25 years to help farmers go organic and to then help build a market. And I hope so many of you who want to help in the virtuous cycle will join in the Fibers of Freedom in whatever way you can. There's also violence to other species. We did studies on the soil, 22% beneficial organisms dead because of the release of the toxin. Studies from Cornell that show that the monarch butterfly was killed when it was fed genetically engineered Bt pollen from corn. Recently, studies have been done in Switzerland that the lacewing beetle larvae are dying. So it's an assault on biodiversity. It's also an attack on science. And I think that's a big issue that we haven't addressed at this conference. Because the point is not just the relationship between spirituality and science, but different kinds of science. And what is parading today is science, is not science anymore. You can't assume that a genetically modified organism is equal to its non-genetically modified parent. They call it substantial equivalence. It's totally cooked up unscientific principle. And then the same companies that say we don't have to be regulated because this is substantially equivalent to the natural, go and say the patent is ours because this is totally new. So it's new when it comes to owning and collecting royalties, and it's the same as nature when it comes to disowning responsibilities for the outcome and the pollution. I call this ontological schizophrenia. And it gets worse. We are constantly told the world will starve without genetic engineering. Chemical use will come down. Pests and weeds will disappear. There has been no yield increase because yield is a multi-genetic trait. It doesn't come out of shooting one toxic gene into a plant. Chemical use has gone up. On our studies, 13 times more chemicals being used for pest control because new pests have been created. And as far as the issue of controlling pests and weeds are concerned, 11 million acres in the United States are now overtaken by superweeds, where they're now recommending use of Agent Orange because Roundup is not working anymore. And in India, as I mentioned, the bollworm has emerged resistance. And then because there is real science being done, what do the corporations do? Go after the scientists. There's such an attack on independent science. I have watched my friend Arpat Putsai lose his job. Ignacio Chapella at Berkeley nearly hounded out. Irina Ernikova of the Russian Academy of Science, who did research on rats, and she wasn't looking for it, but found that GM feed gave half the rats tumors. All that is being shut down, so you'd have a don't look, don't see policy, and therefore you say no harm, no proof. It's also an attack at a very basic level on democracy and freedom, an issue that has come up in this conference very often. We don't need this kind of manipulation of our knowledge, our democracy, our biodiversity, our food system, the killing of our farmers, and the destruction of the life-giving potential of seed. Because it is possible to produce more food by working with the earth, working with nature. We've done a study called Health Per Acre, because I was starting to get a bit fed up with the yield per acre assessment. It measures nothing. Yield per acre measures how much commodity you produce. It doesn't tell you what you stopped producing, and it doesn't tell you how much it cost ecologically, financially, and socially. And in any case, these commodities aren't going to feed people. A lot of it is going for animal feed. A large part is now going for biofuel because of the subsidies, so it's not food for people. Our study on actual practices of biodiverse organic farming compared to monocultures of chemical farming show that we could, for example, be producing 128 kilograms per acre more of protein, which would feed 2.5 billion people a year if it was practiced as the agriculture across the country. Beta-carotene, they want to do a genetically engineered golden rice with pathetic 34 micrograms of vitamin A equivalent. We can produce 2,174 and have enough vitamin A for 1.5 billion adults every year. Folic acid, we can produce 1.7 billion, for 1.7 billion pregnant women. Iron, which is the most significant reason for anemia in women, iron deficiency, for 20 billion we could be producing it. If you weren't wiping out your greens with herbicides, if you weren't destroying the diversity of your crops, as Gandhi had said, the earth has enough for everyone's needs, but not for some people's greed. And that is why we practice what I call earth democracy, the recognition that you are part of the earth, the recognition that we have shrunk our existence, our brains, our minds, our potential, first from understanding the universe, shrinking it, forgetting the earth and Gaia, forgetting other species, making it all anthropocentric, but as if that wasn't enough, forgetting the women, forgetting non-Western cultures, forgetting all they know, and assuming that the only knowledge is the knowledge that serves power rather than life. So I left university and I left my love affair with the quanta because I found that the assault on life of both human beings and the diversity of other life forms was now so intense that if we did not respond soon enough, we could make this land, this earth, uninhabitable for ourselves. And that's why I've started the Earth University, the Beej Vidyapeeth, along with Satish. We're trying to create gardens of hope with the widows, with the children, which create care for the earth, relationship, and actually give us more nutrition. We need a shift in consciousness that allows us to see the abundance that nature gives us, to allow us to be co-creators and not conquerors. And I want to end with a quotation from Tagore, from Banopani, the voice of the forest. The language of nature, he says, is the eternal language of creation. It penetrates reality to reach the deepest layers of our consciousness. It draws upon a language that has survived thousands of years with the human. It is the musical instrument of nature. It replicates the rhythm inherent in life itself. If we listen carefully, we will be able to trace within them the murmurs of eternity, where the spirit of liberation, peace, and beauty lurk. It reminds us of the sea, that is Santam, Shivam, Advaitam. It reminds us of our bond with the world. If we accept this music of the wild within us, we can perceive the great music of oneness.